Chapter 5 continues. We had come to the narrowest part of the path so far, so that you almost only had room for one foot in front of the other. There was a scrubby, sheer drop to the right, where the mountain plunged down into what looked like a bottomless gorge, and another larger mountain loomed up beyond that. To the left, our mountain continued up, higher above the path. The rocky outcrop, dotted with a few bent bushes, nearly knocked your shoulder as you passed. I found it easier going if you didn't look down. I looked ahead to see how the donkey managed. She was now in the lead, as the safest one to check the way for us. Under the packs her little rump was, I saw, narrower than any of us, except maybe for me. Her hocks almost bumped together, and her hoofs were tiny, tip-tapping along the hard rock. "Maybe your wolf will bring us something else for tea tonight, Tiger?" said Dad, always a big eater and missing lunch more than the rest of us. Suddenly I saw the donkey tilt her head sideways, roll her big eyes, and jump to the right with all 4 feet at the same time. I just had time to glance up at the rocky outcrop to see what had startled her before I realized she was almost over the edge. Her front and back hoofs on the right-hand side slithered off the path. Frantically she managed to twist so that both front hoofs were on the path, but in doing so lost her other back hoof over the edge. Her back end swung out over the gorge, so for a second she seemed to be only touching the ground with her front feet. She let out a bray of fear. We froze for a second. Then, as the dust whirled and the loose pebbles bounced away down the gorge, we realized that she was still there. Somehow just the toes of her back hoofs balanced on a jutting edge of loose rock. The guide rushed to her head, but there was no rope to grab. Instead, he threw one arm around the trunk of the nearest bush, which clung perilously to the edge of the path in the thin soil, and the other arm around her thin neck. He had her, but she wheezed and gasped, whether in fear or because the guide's vice-like grip was throttling her, I didn't know. Mum seized her spiky forelock, as she would have led a pony back in her home country, and braced herself on the path, but the guide said urgently, "No, or at the least take the bush with your other hand, or she will take you over when she slips again." I didn't like the when instead of if. Mum and the guide had the donkey for the moment, but there was no way they could pull her up, and no way the donkey could pull herself up, with both hind feet balanced on the rubble that would give any way any moment. And that is the end of Chapter 5. Chapter 6. Dad, who had been standing thunderstruck, seemed to give himself a shake. "It's the packs," he said, darting over to the guide and fumbling for his knife in its sheath at its side. "She could get up if it wasn't for the packs." The guide said nothing, but held desperately to donkey and bush. More stones slid away with a hollow rattle down into the gorge. The donkey stood tense all over with the effort of balancing, her eyes wide with fear and her mouth open and gasping. Mum said, "But," and then fell silent. Dad sat down on the edge of the path by the donkey's front feet, and his fingers felt along an old tree root. It curved out and back into the soil again like a perfect handle. He pushed his left hand between it and the rock and gave a good pull. It seemed to hold well enough to satisfy him, and crouching down, keeping one foot on the path and one just below the root, he reached up with his knife in his right hand and slashed and sawed at the straps holding our bags. The guide's knife must have been very sharp. As quick as a flash, one after the other, the bags fell and crashed away down the gorge. "Now," said Dad, backing up and reaching the path, and he seized a handful of the donkey's mane and one of her ears, disregarding the advice about holding on to the bush, and all three of them heaved. The donkey realized what was going on, made a desperate effort with her shoulders, and managed to get her back feet onto the edge of the path in one bound, almost treading on her front ones. She made one spring forward and was safe, Dad leaping out of her way in the nick of time, with the guide and Mum almost knocked flying. No one could speak for a moment, but coughed and gasped and banged the dust off themselves, while I just stood as rooted to the spot as I had been when the donkey had first shied. The whole thing must have been over in a few seconds, but it had seemed like a lifetime. "Well done, that was very well done," said the guide to Dad. "I would not have acted quicker. Only you had the arms long enough to reach so far, but your packs, and concern crossed his face. If the donkey went, all the packs went too anyway, said Dad. Better save the donkey and at least half of our stuff. He tried to sound matter of fact, but tried a bit too hard, so we all realized at once that he had really only thought of saving the donkey. Parents are so strange. You would have had Mum down for the animal lover, as Dad didn't seem to be too interested in them, to be honest. But he had grown fonder of the donkey than any of us, except maybe the guide, though he wouldn't admit it. We all looked at him, the guide puzzled, and me and Mum surprised, and then Mum laughed and threw her arms around Dad and gave him a big kiss, and then did the same to the donkey. I'm not sure anyone else had done that to the donkey before, but she seemed not to mind and perhaps even liked it. The guide's smiles disappeared as he turned to examine his previously expertly tied load, or what was left of it. The donkey now had bags only on one side, but still had the cut straps attached, so he could unload her and redistribute the weight evenly. This was very difficult on the narrow mountain path. The guide battled to tie on the bags with his back to the donkey, or to the rocky outcrop, when there was really only room for either donkey or man, but not alongside but each other. Understandably, the donkey seemed nervous of standing on the edge of the path and pressed against him. Eventually, however, he managed. "We've lost none of the blankets, at least," he said. "Some firewood, but that's not too serious. Most of the cooking equipment is gone, and all but one bottle of water. I'm sorry." We were all surprised at his apology. "It wasn't anyone's fault," said Mum. "Something frightened her. I'm sure she wouldn't have fallen if she hadn't been badly scared." "I saw it," I said. Mum and Dad looked at me, and the guide, too, added, "I, too." It was true. When I had glanced up to see what the donkey was looking at just as she jumped sideways, I'd caught a glimpse of a disappearing bushy tail held low. "Some kind of dog again," I said, checking across at the guide with my eyes for confirmation that he'd seen the same thing. He nodded. "And I'd just made that quip about your wolf bringing us another rabbit," said Dad. "I bet it was the same one." "No, it couldn't have been," I said firmly, and they all looked questioningly at me, except perhaps the guide, who looked as if he knew what I was going to say. "Because the donkey saw my dog or wolf last night. I think that's why I wasn't scared, because she wasn't." Mum and Dad didn't seem to know quite what to make of this, but looked over interestedly at the donkey, who just looked back at them rather blankly. After this incident, the guide walked in front of the donkey to give her reassurance in case she saw anything scary again. I felt sorry for her. She kept well away from the edge now, but kept tilting her head to look up at the outcrop, just in case there was anything up there about to leap upon her. In the end, she must have grown tired of twisting her neck, because she settled down to her normal way of going, and we made good progress, reaching the top of the pass just as night began to fall. And that is the end of chapter 6.